for its work and commend the bill to the House. Thank you.
Dr David Clark.
Mr Speaker, I rise to support this legislation. We wholeheartedly, as a Labour Party, support this legislation, recognising that smoking remains the single biggest cause of preventable morbidity and mortality in New Zealand. The past Speaker referenced the importance of being positive about this change, and indeed we do support it. We think that this is the way to address smoking. It's very clear that price levers are amongst the most effective tobacco control measures. They make it harder for young people to start, and they make it more difficult for the tobacco industry to retain their clients in this industry that affects about 1 in 5 current adults in New Zealand. It's interesting, of course, to note that historically the National Party, while they're calling for support now, opposed such measures, and the previous member may not recall, there seems to be a little bit of that going around the National Party at the moment, that recollection loss. But the Honourable Bill English said in 2000 that the reason that the National Party voted against these kinds of measures was because it's a tax on the poorest people in New Zealand. It's an increase that is far too large, and that is why we voted against it in opposing such an excise tax message not so very long ago. So they may have forgotten that they had a different stance. In this case, we celebrate that lack of memory from the National Party. In other cases, we've been a little more critical where the private details of New Zealanders are concerned. But in this case, it is a happy thing that the National Party have forgotten that they opposed this kind of increase on supposedly principled grounds. Now, I, Mr Speaker, am a little bit suspicious that what really is going on here is a revenue grab. It's actually a naked revenue grab. And the chair of the FEC tells me not to be suspicious in this regard, but I'm afraid his body language is not convincing, and it's a little too late, because we know that the government has a significant revenue hole. This is an excise bill we're debating here in Parliament. The government has a revenue hole since revenues dropped 4% under its watch. And its own officials say that 1.5% of that can be attributed to the global financial crisis, roughly in line with other countries around the world, but that 2.5% of that revenue drop is directly a response to government policy changes. Now, the 2010 tax switch that this government put through, we were assured was going to grow the economy, and actually what we've seen is the economy in real terms struggling. And the only reason we've had any growth figures whatsoever is due to population growth. Real wages for New Zealand workers have gone down. And these 2010 tax measures, which switched around the way who got what tax cuts and how much of the value of the produce that New Zealand made went where, were not to the benefit of the majority of New Zealanders. 44% of the value of those tax cuts in 2010 went to the top 10% of earners. Just 2% went to the bottom 20% of earners, and that's hardly fair. But what we were told at the time was that this would grow the economy, that it was broadly fiscally neutral. If you can remember back that far, Mr Speaker, and I'm sure you can, we were told it was broadly fiscally neutral. And the effect has been not broadly fiscally neutral, in my opinion, because what's happened is that those revenue drops have happened, the government is now scrabbling around, and here we have a measure that looks more like something that is to do with expedience than something that is to do with principle when we look back on its track record. I'm very proud to be a Labour Member of Parliament because Labour has taken a stance on this issue that is consistent over time, that is principled, that is actually about reducing harm that is linked to tobacco use. And so the National Party's stance stands out starkly in contrast to that when we see a revenue hole emerging and a different stance being taken. Now, they have had various other measures that we've seen recently in this Parliament that are along a similar line to fill this revenue hole. We've seen the car park tax recently announced. I'm sure we'll see legislation around that before too long. We had the paper boys and we had the cleaners, and now we have a tax increase in the tobacco area. Now, what we also know is that those who will struggle the most with this, of course, that the National Party had a good point originally, is those who are poorest, because they have the least room to move. It will affect people who are poor the most, and Labor has some sympathy about that. That's why we have said we would like the government to undertake a review of the CPI and how it is used to index government payments and revenue, because at the moment it is used in an inconsistent and sometimes discriminatory way. For example, the bills that we're looking for today ensure that CPI minus tobacco is used for benefits and superannuation, yet the full CPI is used for annual excise tax increases on petrol. And the full CPI continues to be used for wage negotiations, aged care subsidies, inflation index bonds, and various long-term contracts in the public and private sector. So there's an inconsistency here which we think should be examined, Mr. Speaker. We will be supporting the measure today because, as I say, we know that this is an effective way to curb tobacco use. Now, one of the things that is deliciously ironic about all of this, of course, is that the National Party were recently, not so long ago, trumpeting the entry and the jobs created by Imperial Tobacco's expansion in Lower Hutt, not so far away. At the time, it was thought that there were going to be 50 new jobs created, and goodness knows we could do with jobs being created in this economy. There were many, many more applications lodged for those jobs than places available, I understand. And so we have some job growth here. Ironically, the delicious irony here is, of course, that this industry will be one of the ones that's in a very short order hit by this measure. And it shows how short-sighted the National Party's thinking is on this and other measures. Of course, when it comes to manufacturing, the real story is that the sector is contracting outside the primary sector, the primary product sector. Simply transformed materials in the manufacturing sector have contracted by 15% since 2008, in $2008. Looking at the figures, a full 15% contraction in that manufacturing sector for simply transformed products, and a 10% contraction in elaborately transformed areas. Now, perhaps tobacco products fits into the primary products processed category, and the statistics on overseas merchandise trade that Statistics New Zealand puts out suggest in their data series that primary products is one of the few areas in New Zealand where the manufacturing sector is surviving. Now, of course, that story, Mr. Speaker, that story is about the way in which our dairying sector carries on. Those products still have to be processed regardless of the high international price. The difficulties with the high dollar and that is creating for exporters. The processing in the primary sector continues, but it's the other sectors of our economy that are really struggling. And one has to wonder whether manufacturing across the board will go down if the government continues to take a short-term view in the way that it does on many issues, where it switches from one position to another. Businesses like certainty, and this issue of customs excise on tobacco is, as I say, an ironic change given Bill English's vehement opposition to a similar change under the Labor government, and also ironic given the touting of these few extra jobs, which presumably, after the $45 million expansion of the plant in Lower Hutt, will now be less secure than they were before. So, Mr. Speaker, to conclude, I want to say that Labor will support this bill because, on principle, we understand and appreciate the importance of raising the price of these dangerous drugs in a way that gives people the chance over time to quit the habit, and we support the measures taken to support people quitting smoking, and we hope that the 1 in 5 New Zealanders who currently smoke will find their own way out of this habit and in part because of the measures proposed in this bill and the previous measures taken by the Labor government in its principled view on this matter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Kevin Haig.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.